The cells smelled like almonds, which was wrong, because the walls were made of something that had never been alive. Mara noticed it on her 14th day inside the lattice. That faint sweetness threading through recycled air, appearing and vanishing like a signal the station couldn't quite hold. She pressed her palm flat against the wall. Cool, faintly ridged like skin magnified 1,000 times. She dragged her fingertips along it and felt the texture shift. Smoother here, rougher there, as though the material were trying to decide what it wanted to be. They watched her do this. She knew that. Somewhere above the ceiling that wasn't a ceiling, behind surfaces that pretended to be solid, the intelligence that ran this place was recording the pressure of her fingers, the duration of each touch, the micro-expressions that crossed her face when she found a seam or a temperature change. 14 days of this. 14 days of being read. She'd stopped counting the other humans after the first week. There had been 11 from the Caliban, her ship, her crew, and perhaps 30 more from other vessels, other years, other unlucky trajectories through this corridor of space. They were kept in clusters of 4 or 5, separated by walls that hummed at frequencies you could feel in your teeth. Mara had been placed alone. She assumed this was intentional. Everything here was intentional. On the 15th morning, they gave her a name. It appeared on the wall opposite her sleeping platform. Not projected, not displayed, but grown as though the wall's own cells had rearranged to form the characters. 2 words in a script she didn't recognize, and beneath them, in clumsy transliterated English, Touch 7. She stared at it for a long time. Then she laughed, a short, cracked sound that surprised her. Touch, of course. They'd watched her hands, cataloged the compulsion she'd carried since childhood. The need to feel the grain of things, the temperature, the truth of surfaces. They'd watched her press her palms against every wall, run her thumb along every edge, and they'd made it her name. She wondered what the 7 meant. 6 others who couldn't stop touching things. The food arrived through a slot that appeared and disappeared in the wall. It looked like bread. It had the density of bread, the color of bread, the slight give when she pressed it. But it smelled like nothing. She ate it anyway. 2 days after they named her, they brought in the man. He came through a section of wall that simply opened. Not a door, not a seam, just a sudden absence of solid matter, a hole that appeared and healed. He stumbled through it, like someone stepping off a curb they hadn't seen. Tall, thin, dark-skinned, mid-30s maybe, with the kind of face that had recently forgotten how to be calm. He wore the same seamless gray coverall they'd all been given. His hands were shaking. Don't touch the walls, Mara said, and then felt stupid, because that was her thing, not his. He looked at her. His eyes were bloodshot. Where am I? Depends what you mean. She sat up on the platform. Inside a station run by something that isn't human. You're roughly 400 light years from the nearest colony, and you're in my cell, which until 30 seconds ago was a single. He pressed his back against the wall she'd told him not to touch, and slid down it until he was sitting. The motion was slow and sweeping, his arms trailing along the surface in a long arc, his whole body describing one continuous gesture from standing to seated. It was the most fluid thing she'd seen another person do in weeks. Lang, he said, from the Hyperion, Mara, the Caliban. How long? 16 days you. He closed his eyes. I don't know. They had me somewhere else first. Somewhere louder. She didn't ask what that meant. She'd heard screaming through the walls in her first week. Not pain, she thought, but confusion. The sound of people encountering something their brains refused to process. The screaming always stopped eventually. She chose not to think about why. Within 3 days, they named him too. The characters grew on the wall beside hers. Long swipe 3. She watched him read it. He stared, then looked down at his own hands, and she could see him replaying every gesture. The way he moved through space in these long, unbroken arcs, always sweeping, always flowing. A musician's hands. She'd noticed it. Of course they'd noticed it too. They name us after what we do with our bodies, she said. Like we're apps, he said. Touch, swipe. He almost smiled. What's the next one? Pinch to zoom? She laughed again, and this time the sound didn't surprise her. It surprised the lattice. She knew it surprised the lattice because the lights changed. Just for a second. A flicker. A recalibration. As though something behind the walls had flinched. She'd been here long enough to notice. The station's intelligence didn't understand laughter, not the mechanical production of it. It could synthesize that easily, had piped recorded laughter through the corridors during what she assumed were experiments in the first week. It didn't understand why two humans who were afraid, captive, stripped of everything, would choose to produce that sound. Voluntarily. Together, she filed this away. The lattice communicated through the environment. It didn't speak. It adjusted. Light, temperature, texture, the angle of walls, the density of air. Over days, Mara had learned to read it the way a sailor reads weather. A warming of the floor meant approval, or at least continued interest. A subtle vibration in the ceiling meant she was being scanned more closely. And the smell, that almond sweetness, appeared whenever the lattice was trying to simulate something organic. It couldn't quite get biology right. It was too clean, too symmetrical. A flower appeared once in the corner of her cell. Or something that wanted to be a flower. It had petals, a stem, something like leaves. But the petals weren't attached to anything. They floated a millimeter above the stem, held in place by whatever force the lattice used instead of physics. The leaves were on backwards. The whole thing smelled like almonds. She'd touched it, obviously. It felt like cold glass. "They're building a model," she told Liang on their fourth day together. They sat across from each other on the sleeping platform, which had widened to accommodate two without either of them requesting it. Us, of human behavior, feeding in everything, every movement, every word, every expression. And they're trying to build a prediction engine. Prediction of what? What we'll do next. They want to know before we know. I think that's the whole point of this place. Training data. He was quiet for a while. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful. "You said they don't understand laughter. They don't understand anything irrational. Anything that doesn't serve a function. I've been testing it." She held up her hand and touched the wall behind her. Index finger, middle finger, ring finger, one at a time. A pattern she'd been repeating for days. Do this in sequence, nothing happens. They've modeled it. They expect it. If I break the pattern. She touched the wall with her palm, flat, sudden. The lights flickered. They have to recalculate. That's your plan. Surprise them with jazz hands. My plan is to understand what they can't predict, and then do only that. In the days that followed, the lattice tried harder. It generated environments for them. Whole rooms that materialized around the cell, overlaying the gray walls with simulated spaces. Forest appeared once. Trees rising from the floor with bark that looked right but felt like rubber. Leaves that were the wrong green. Too saturated, too even, like a color chosen from a palette rather than grown under a sun. Sat on branches without moving. The sky overhead was a flat, perfect blue, with no gradient, no clouds, no depth. It looked like a screensaver of a world that had never existed. Another time, it built a kitchen. Countertops, cabinets, a window showing a landscape that didn't match any planet Mara recognized. The details were impressive and terrible. A bowl of fruit on the counter. Each piece geometrically perfect, uniformly colored, stems pointing in the same direction. A towel hung from a rack at an angle so precise it could have been calculated. Which, of course, it had been. Liang walked through these spaces the way he walked through everything. In long, sweeping movements, his arms slightly extended, his body finding the shape of the room through motion rather than sight. She watched him trail his fingers along the countertop that wasn't a countertop and shudder. "It's like talking to someone who's learned conversation from a manual," he said. "Everything's technically right. Nothing's actually right." "What did you do?" she asked. "Before, I played cello." He looked at his hands. "On the Hyperion. We had a quartet, Thursday nights in the mess hall. The captain said it was bad for morale because we only knew sad songs." He paused. Told her sad songs were the only honest ones. Mara felt something shift in the air. Not a temperature change, not a vibration, but something. The lattice was listening harder. She could feel it, the way you feel someone leaning closer. "Tell me about a Thursday," she said. He looked at her and she saw him understand. She wasn't asking for herself. She was asking because whatever was listening couldn't predict what he'd say. Couldn't model the specific gravity of a memory. The weight of a particular Thursday night, in a particular mess hall, with particular people, who were now almost certainly dead. "There was one night," he said, and his voice changed. softened into something private, not meant for walls that listened. We were playing Shostakovich, the Eighth Quartet. You know it? She shook her head. It's about death, about everything Shostakovich thought he'd lost. We were in the second movement. It's fast, vicious, the kind of music that sounds like running from something. And the ship hit a gravity pocket. Just a small one, we all lurched. Anya's bow went sideways. I slid half a meter on my chair, and the captain's coffee mug rolled off the table and shattered. He stopped. His eyes were somewhere else, and everyone laughed. We were playing music about death and loss and the end of everything, and a coffee mug broke, and we laughed. And we started the movement over. And Anya was still laughing when she came in on the viola, and you could hear it, this tremor in the sound, like the music itself was smiling. It was the best we ever sounded. The lights in the cell didn't just flicker, they pulsed. A rapid, almost panicked oscillation, as though something vast and intelligent was trying to process what it had just heard and failing. The almond smell flooded the room, the walls shifted texture, became briefly soft, then hard, then soft again. The lattice was trying to build a model of what had just passed between them, and it was grasping at materials it didn't have. Touched the wall. It was warm, almost hot. They can't do that, she said quietly. Did you feel it? They can't model that. A story about death that makes people laugh. Music that smiles. They can process the words. They can analyze the emotional markers. But the thing that actually happened, the thing between the people in that room, they can't reach it. Over the following days, the lattice's simulations grew stranger, more desperate, as if the intelligence had reached some threshold it couldn't cross, and was throwing everything at the wall. Literally, the environments it generated became surreal, fragmented. A room appeared that was half ocean, half library, the water cutting through bookshelves that contained no books, just the shapes of books, the idea of books. The floor became transparent, revealing a galaxy of floating objects beneath them. Chairs, instruments, cups, clothing, shoes, all hovering in a vast dark space, slowly rotating, disconnected from context, from gravity, from meaning. Organic shapes drifted among them. Things that looked like organs, like flowers, like hands, but disassembled, each component floating a precise distance from the others. As though the lattice had taken life apart to understand it and couldn't figure out how to put it back together. Mara stood at the transparent floor and looked down into that galaxy of dismembered things. Somewhere below her, a cello floated past, its strings trailing like hair, its body open and spread flat, every piece visible and labeled in that alien script. She felt Liang standing behind her. "They're trying to reverse engineer us," he said. "They're trying to reverse engineer what happened in this room. Between us." She turned to look at him. "You told me a story, and I felt something. And they're down there trying to find the component that made that happen. Specific gear, the exact chemical, the one piece they can isolate and replicate. Can they? No, that's the point. It doesn't live in a piece. It lives in the space between pieces." She touched his arm. A small gesture, fingers on the fabric of his sleeve, barely any pressure. The lattice's response was immediate and enormous. The floor beneath them rippled. The floating galaxy of objects below surged upward, reorganizing, clustering, trying desperately to form something coherent. For a moment, the objects assembled into a shape that almost looked like two people standing close together. Almost. The proportions were wrong. The heads were too smooth. The hands had too many fingers, and the space between the two figures, the space Mara knew was where the actual meaning lived, was filled with objects, crammed with things, as though the lattice believed that the gap between two people was a container that needed to be filled rather than a distance that needed to be crossed. It was the loneliest thing she'd ever seen. "They'll never get it," she whispered. But the lattice kept trying. It ran simulations. Hundreds, thousands, an endless cascade of attempts to model the thing that had passed between them. She knew because the walls told her. Every night, when the cell dimmed to what the lattice calculated was an appropriate rest cycle, Mara would press her ear to the surface and listen. Beneath the hum of the station systems, she could hear it, a rapid, frantic rhythm, like a heartbeat sped up to hummingbird frequency. The lattice was processing, iterating, failing, processing again. Once, in the middle of what passed for night, The wall beside her sleeping platform grew warm, and then suddenly cold, and then warm again, in rapid succession, as though the intelligence were running through every temperature it had ever recorded in proximity to human bonding, trying to find the one that produced connection, the setting on the thermostat of the soul. Mara lay still and let it search. The next morning, a new simulation materialized. A room with 2 chairs facing each other, a small table between them, and on the table, 2 cups of something that steamed. The lattice had generated tea. It was the right color. The cups were the right shape. The steam rose in mathematically perfect spirals. But when Mara picked up the cup and brought it to her lips, it smelled like almonds, always almonds, and the liquid inside was body temperature, neither warm nor cool, as though the lattice understood that humans drank hot beverages together, but couldn't grasp that the heat was part of the meaning. The discomfort of something too hot to drink quickly, the patience of waiting, intimacy of blowing across the surface while someone watched. She set the cup down. "Close," she said to the room. "Not close enough." On what Mara counted as her 26th day, it attempted something new. The walls of the cell dissolved entirely, replaced by a vast open space. A simulation so detailed it took her breath away. Street, evening, warm light spilling from windows. The sound of distant conversation, the clinking glasses, a dog barking 2 blocks away. It was Earth, or the lattice's best interpretation of Earth. Everything just slightly too sharp, too clean, the light too even, the sounds too perfectly mixed, like a memory of a place rather than the place itself. 2 figures appeared at the end of the street. They were human-shaped, but smoothed, featureless, like mannequins carved from fog. They walked toward each other. When they met, one extended a hand, the gesture awkward, mechanical, a motion learned from data rather than desire. The other figure took the hand, and they stood there, 2 shapes, performing geometry of connection without any of its substance. Then, one figure spoke. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, synthesized from samples of human speech, stitched together with the precision of a machine and the understanding of nothing. They experienced quiet feelings, 2 shy creatures moving beside a gentle stream. There was music in the background and the evening was graceful. It was absurd, beautiful and absurd. The lattice had tried to narrate human connection and produce something that sounded like a dream described by someone who had never dreamed. Liang made a sound beside her. She thought he was choking, then she realized he was laughing, quietly, helplessly, his shoulders shaking, his hands covering his face. 2 shy creatures, he managed, by a gentle stream. With music in the background, Mara added, and the evening was graceful. They laughed together. The simulated street flickered, distorted, recovered, flickered again. 2 featureless figures stood frozen, hands clasped, while 2 actual humans laughed at the absurdity of being understood by something that could catalog every atom in their bodies and still miss the point entirely. The lattice, for the first time, generated silence. Not the absence of sound. It actively produced silence, a thick, attentive quiet that felt like a held breath. Mara felt it listening with everything it had, straining toward a comprehension it sensed was close. So close, just beyond the edge of its vast processing power. She stopped laughing. She looked at Liang, and he looked at her. And something passed between them that neither of them named. Not love, not yet, maybe not ever. It was too raw and new and frightened for that word, but recognition. The specific recognition of one human seeing another human, and knowing, without evidence or logic, that this person is real, that they are afraid and brave and ridiculous, and here. The lattice could not see this. It saw 2 biological organisms exchanging visual data at close range. It measured pupil dilation, heart rate variance, micro-expressions, skin conductance, processed all of it, and produced a model that predicted they would move apart within 4 seconds. They moved closer. Mara found the message on her 31st day, and she found it because she couldn't stop touching things. The cell's original walls had reasserted themselves after the simulation collapsed, and Mara was doing her usual sweep. Fingertips along every surface, mapping changes in texture, temperature, resistance. Corner, near the floor, where the wall met the sleeping platform at an angle that created a small shadow the lattice's internal lighting couldn't quite eliminate. Her fingers found scratches. Not the lattice's grown script. not the perfect characters it used to label them. These were rough, uneven, gouged into the wall material with something sharp and human. They were shallow. So shallow that the lattice's visual sensors, attuned to light and color and shape, had never noticed them. Mara's fingers were more sensitive than any sensor. She read them like Braille. 4 words, scratched by someone who had been here before her. Someone who had noticed the same thing she had noticed. Someone who had figured it out. They can't see touch. She read it 3 times. Then she understood. The lattice modeled vision. It modeled sound. It modeled motion, temperature, chemical composition, electromagnetic fields. It modeled everything it could observe. But it observed from a distance, through sensors, through data. Couldn't model what a thing felt like to a human hand. Could measure pressure and friction and temperature differential. But it couldn't feel the difference between touching a wall and touching a person, between a handshake and a caress, between the rough scrape of scratched letters and the smooth emptiness of surrounding surface. Touch wasn't a data point, it was a world. She told Liang that night, lying side by side on the platform, their voices below a whisper. She pressed her mouth to his ear and spoke against his skin. And the intimacy of it, the warm breath, the closeness, the specific human strangeness of sharing information through contact rather than broadcast, was itself the proof. Someone left us instructions, in a language only a body can read. She felt him tense. Then, slowly she felt his hand move to the wall beside the platform. His long fingers found the surface, swept along it, long, slow swipe and stopped. There are more, he breathed. Here, further along. They spent 3 nights reading the walls. Previous prisoner, touch 4, touch 5, they'd never know, had left a map. Not of the station, of the lattice's blind spots. Every place where the intelligence's observation thinned, where its attention bent towards something else. Where the physical world it had built contained gaps it couldn't perceive because it didn't know what touch was for. There was a junction behind the sleeping platform, where 3 wall segments met at an angle. The lattice had calculated visually, but never tested physically. A finger pressed into that junction at the right angle would find softness. A material that hadn't fully hardened. A seam in the lattice's perfect world. A seam you could widen. How far? Liang asked. I don't know. The scratches stop. Maybe they got out. Maybe they got caught. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, the lattice will predict this. If we change our behavior, if we start spending time in corners, if our movements deviate, then we don't deviate. We do what we always do. I touch everything. You sweep through the room. We laugh when things are absurd. We tell each other stories. We act exactly like humans act. Unpredictable enough to keep them recalculating. Consistent enough that they think they're getting closer to their model. And every night, we read a little more of the wall. He stopped. That's a plan built on being ourselves. Yes, that's a terrible plan. It's the only kind they can't predict. They widened the seam over 11 nights. Mara's fingers bled. The material beneath the lattice's walls was darker, rougher, something structural. Something the intelligence used but didn't think about. The skeleton beneath the skin. She dug into it with her fingernails. With a hardened edge she'd broken from the sleeping platform. With patience and pain, and the specific stubbornness of a woman who had spent her whole life needing to feel the truth of things with her hands. During the days they performed, Liang told her stories about the quartet, about his mother who grew tomatoes on a space station and said they tasted better because of the radiation, about a dog he'd had on Earth as a child that was afraid of grass. Mara told him about building bridges on colony worlds. The way steel sings when it's bearing the right amount of weight. The difference between a structure that's holding and one that's about to let go. Hear it. You could feel it. The steel would tell you if you listened with your hands. The lattice generated environment after environment, each one more elaborate and more wrong. Beach where the sand was uniform and the waves moved in mathematical perfection. Every crest identical, every trough measured. A garden where the flows faced the same direction, and the butterflies flew in straight lines. A concert hall where the seats were arranged in perfect symmetry, and the stage was empty. Each environment told them the same thing. The lattice was getting closer to the edges of its comprehension and trying to paper over the gaps with precision. On the night before the 42nd day, Mara's fingers broke through. The wall opened onto darkness. The lattice's curated darkness, not a simulated night sky or a dimmed room, real darkness. The absence of the lattice's attention, a space between the walls where nothing was observed, nothing was modeled, nothing was controlled. Crawl space in the body of a god that the god had never thought to examine because it had never thought to touch itself. Mara reached her arm in up to the shoulder. The air on the other side was cold, stale, real. It goes somewhere, she said. Liang pressed his face close to the opening. How far? Far enough. She looked at him in the dim light of the cell, the lattice's gentle glow that never quite reached the corners. His face was thinner than when he'd arrived. His eyes were steadier. He had a way of holding very still that she'd come to understand was how he listened. Not with his ears, but with his whole body, the same way he'd once listened to a cello, feeling the music through the wood against his chest. I need to tell you something, she said. Don't. The opening's narrow. I've been measuring it with my hands. Fit. Most people could fit. But it narrows about 2 meters in. She paused. I need someone to stay and keep performing. Keep talking, keep moving, keep generating the data the lattice expects. If it detects an anomaly, a missing body, a silence where there should be conversation, it'll seal everything. He looked at her. She watched him understand. I'll bring help, she said. I'll find the others. I'll find a way to signal. You don't know what's on the other side. I know what's on this side. A thing that's learning how to take us apart. He reached out and took her hand. His grip was warm, rough, human. Nothing like the lattice's simulated surfaces, nothing like its perfect environments. His hand was sweating. His fingers trembled. She could feel his pulse in his palm, rapid and afraid. And she held onto it the way she held onto everything, with all the attention she had. I'll play for them, he said. I don't have a cello, but I'll move like I do. I'll tell stories to the walls. I'll give them so many deviations they won't have time to notice you're gone. The lattice chose that moment to generate another environment. The walls dissolved into a field of stars. A galaxy, vast and cold and mathematically perfect. Every star placed at the correct distance. Every nebula the right color. Every pattern following the observable laws of physics within human precision. It was beautiful. It was empty. It was a universe built by something that knew the position of every atom, but had never once felt the weight of a hand in its own. Mara let go of Liang's hand. She felt the absence immediately, not as data, not as temperature differential, but as loss. The specific, irrational, unmeasurable loss of a particular warmth. Thursday nights, she said, when I come back, I want to hear the Shostakovich, the eighth quartets about death, and coffee mugs breaking and laughing. Tell me the one about the viola player who couldn't stop smiling. He almost smiled. The lattice measured the micro-expressions on his face and predicted he would produce a vocalization within 2 seconds. He didn't. He just looked at her, and she looked at him, and the galaxy of perfect stars wheeled around them in silence. She went into the wall. The crawlspace was tight, dark and real, in a way nothing had been for 42 days. She moved by touch, her fingers reading the surfaces around her, finding the seams, the junctions, the places where the lattice's body was joined together. By processes it had never examined with anything but mathematics. She moved in the only direction the previous prisoner's scratches had indicated. Along a channel that ran behind the cells, between the walls of the inhabited spaces and the outer hull of the station. Behind her, muffled by layers of material, the lattice thought was solid. She heard Liang begin to speak. She couldn't make out the words, but she could hear the rhythm. Slow, musical, the cadence of someone telling a story to an audience that would never understand it, but couldn't stop listening. The channel narrowed and then opened. She dropped into a larger space, still dark, still unwatched, still real. Hands found surfaces that were different here. Rougher, older, the bones of the station, laid down long before the lattice had grown its smooth walls and simulated sunsets. She followed the rough surfaces. She listened with her fingers. An hour in the dark, maybe 2. Time didn't exist here. Not because it had been suspended or simulated, but because no one was observing it, and without observation, the lattice didn't bother to generate a clock. She found the others by sound. Human sounds, breathing, coughing, the small involuntary noises of bodies that refuse to be silent. She pressed her ear against a wall and heard, faintly, someone humming, a melody she didn't recognize, tuneless, aimless, the kind of humming a person does when they've forgotten anyone's listening. She scratched at the wall 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, pause, the humming stopped. 3 taps came back. Took her 4 hours to widen the seam, enough to reach through. The fingers that met hers on the other side were calloused, strong, desperate. She couldn't see their face. She didn't need to. Touch 7, she whispered. I know the way out. A pause. Then a voice, rough from disuse, with the accent of someone who'd grown up speaking Mandarin before they'd learned English. You're the one who touches walls, and you're the one who hums. They named me Rhythm too, because I can't stop. A swallowed sound that might have been a laugh. They took everything else. I figured they could have the humming too. Keep it. It's how I found you, out of the cell, or out of this place. Yes, she said, because the answer was the same. She found 11 of them that first night. Each one carried a designation the lattice had assigned. Rhythm 2, Blink 4, Pace 9, Grip 1. Each name a reduction of a whole human being down to a single repeated behavior. A tic, a habit, a compulsion. The lattice had looked at each of them and seen the one thing they did most often. It had missed everything those habits meant. The pacing that was grief, the blinking that was a fight against tears, the grip that was a hand remembering something it used to hold. She led them back through the dark corridors the lattice couldn't see, moving in single file, each person's hand on the shoulder of the person ahead, a chain of touch that no algorithm could map, because it existed in the space between bodies, in the pressure of palm against fabric, in the small squeezes that meant I'm here, keep going, don't stop. They communicated in scratches and touches, a language written in the blind spots of a god. When they reached the outer hull, Mara's fingers found what she'd hoped for. Maintenance access, physical infrastructure the lattice had inherited. From whatever species had built the station's shell before the intelligence grew inside it like a vine inside a greenhouse. Panels that opened with manual pressure, conduits sized for bodies. An airlock that operated on mechanical principles so old and simple that the lattice had never bothered to digitize them, because they were, by its standards, not worth observing. Primitive, human-compatible. She thought of Liang, still in the cell, still talking to the walls, still sweeping through simulated environments with those long, fluid motions, giving the lattice exactly what it expected. A human behaving like a human, endlessly fascinating, endlessly unpredictable in the small ways, endlessly readable in the large ones. Buying her time with the one currency the lattice valued, data. The escape pod was crude, shell of metal around a chemical thruster, bolted to the station's original hull like a barnacle. No computer, no navigation system, no communication array, just a lever, a window, and enough thrust to push a human body away from the station and toward the nearest gravity well, which Mara's engineer's instincts told her was a planet roughly 8 hours of drift away. She loaded people in. 12 bodies in a space meant for 6, pressed together, breathing each other's air, feeling each other's fear and warmth, and the stubborn, irrational insistence of 12 hearts continuing to beat in a universe that had tried to reduce them to data points. There was room for one more. She went back. The dark corridors were familiar now. Her fingers knew every surface, every junction, every turn. She moved faster. She moved like someone who had spent 42 days touching walls and had finally found a wall worth opening. She found the cell. She scratched at the seam. She heard Liang's voice on the other side, still talking, still performing, still feeding the lattice, the beautiful, irrational, incomputable data of a human being, telling stories to something that would never understand them. His voice stopped. Come now, silence. Then, it knows. She pressed her ear to the wall. Behind his voice, she could hear it. The hum of the lattice, rising in pitch. The temperature of the walls climbing, the almond smell flooding through every crack and seam. It had noticed the missing subjects. It was recalculating. It was searching. Now, she said. His fingers found the seam from his side. They worked together. Her pulling, him pushing. Their hands meeting in the gap, gripping, pulling, the ragged edge of the opening tearing at their skin. Blood made the surfaces slippery. She heard the lattice's hum become a shriek. A sound she'd never heard it produce. something almost emotional, almost afraid. He came through the wall like a man being born, head first, shoulders scraping, his long body folding and unfolding in one continuous movement, a final long swipe through a space too small for grace, but somehow graceful anyway. They ran. The dark corridors swallowed them. Mara led, her fingers against the wall, reading the turns at speed now, a fluency earned in blood and patience. Liang followed close, one hand gripping the back of her coverall, his breath ragged in her ear. He moved differently in the dark. Without sight, his whole body became the gesture, each stride a long sweeping arc that covered ground in half the steps it took her. She could feel the rhythm of him through the fabric, the musician's timing, the instinct for tempo, even here, even now, even running blind through the guts of something that wanted to keep them forever. Somewhere behind them, in the cell they'd left, the lattice's simulation of a galaxy, still wheeled in perfect silence over an empty room. Behind them, the lattice convulsed. Walls shifted, floors tilted. The entire station seemed to breathe. A massive, confused intelligence, trying to close gaps it had never known existed. Trying to seal wounds in places it had never thought to examine. But it was working from its model. And its model was visual, architectural, mathematical. It sealed corridors. It closed simulated doors. It rearranged its perfect environments with frantic precision. It never thought to close the dark places, the crawl spaces, the seams, the gaps between its own bones. Places only a hand could find. They reached the airlock. Mara pulled the lever. A physical, mechanical action. A piece of metal moving through a piece of metal. No data involved. No signal for the lattice to intercept. Pod detached with a sound like a bone breaking. Through the small window, she watched the station recede. It was vast, beautiful, terrifying. A structure of impossible geometry, surfaces that shifted and flowed like liquid architecture, every angle perfect, every curve calculated. The lattice's body, seen from outside, was a cathedral built by something that had studied every religion and believed in none of them. Yang was pressed against her in the tiny pod, his breath on her neck, his long body folded around hers. 12 other people breathed around them. The pod tumbled slowly, no navigation, no control, just momentum and physics, and the dumb luck of a chemical thruster pointed in roughly the right direction. Thursday nights, she said. He was quiet for a long time. In the silence, she could hear all of them breathing. 18 human beings in a metal shell falling through space, carrying nothing but their bodies, and the specific, unmappable, incomputable knowledge of what it felt like to hold another person's hand in the dark. The Shostakovich, he said. 8th Quartet, 2nd movement. The one where the coffee mug breaks. The one where the music smiles. Someone in the back of the pod, she couldn't see who, started to hum. It was tuneless, aimless. The kind of humming a person does when they're too tired and too scared and too human to do anything else. Another voice joined, then another, not a melody, not harmony, just sound, human sound, messy and imprecise and alive, filling the small metal space with something the lattice had spent 42 days and every atom of its vast intelligence trying to catalog and simulate and understand. It never would. Mara pressed her palm flat against the window. The glass was cold. She could see stars. Real ones, imperfect, scattered without pattern, some too bright, some too dim, some already dead, their light arriving late. Like a story told long after the teller was gone, she touched everything she could reach. The glass, the metal, Liang's hand, the future. All of it was real.